Kirby Smart posed a question in a press conference back in April. The weeks leading up to G Day when Georgia's dealing with spring practice, we get to meet with the coaches and the players a couple times a week during that sequence. A little bit in March, a little bit in April, and Dominic Lovett is a player that was a hot topic during spring practice this year. He ends up backing up all of that talk at G Day. Of course, has over 100 yards, has the big catch in the corner of the end zone that was a touchdown where he catches it around the defender's back. He looks like someone who can really step up and become a star in Georgia's offense, who was losing players that certainly had star power in Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey. Brock Bowers having superstar power at the college football level. Well, Kirby talked about how good Dominic Lovett was, and he talked about how he was really dominant out there. Those are literally his exact words about how he was dominant out there. But then he poses a question, and it's an important question. And this is coach speak, and he's talking about trying not to belittle his guys too much, trying not to put his guys up on a pedestal too high. And this is what he ends up saying about Dominic Lovett doing really well, wide receiver for Georgia this spring. He says, "There's been days Dominic Lovett has been really dominant out there. Now, you've got to say, is that because Tyke Smith and Javon Bullard aren't out there covering him, so he's making more plays? Or is that because Dom's more comfortable in the offense and he's winning at a higher rate?" That was back during spring practice. Right, so he praises Dominic Lovett, talks about how he's being dominant out there, how there's just been days where he's really, really good as a wide receiver for Georgia in practice, and then he kind of backhand compliments it. Well, is that really just because Tyke Smith, Javon Bullard, Kamari Lassiter, those guys aren't out there anymore? And that brings it to the larger question about Georgia's secondary this season. And is it going to be as good as it's been the last few years? They've got to replace a few guys. Georgia's had to replace guys over and over in the secondary, and over really across the board, right? Sometimes that lends to down years for a position group. Sometimes it all stacks up and a position group's got it all figured out for one season. But I think when you look at this year's secondary room, it's a defense that there's a little bit more youth in it. I think the defensive line, you've got some older guys. You've got a couple of fifth-year seniors in Warren Brinson, in Nazir Stackhouse. You've got a couple of studs. Malachi Starks is a third year. Michael Williams is third year. You've got a senior in Smile London, but you've got a lot of youth as well. Some edge rushers that are going to be young, some linebackers that as talented as we talk about these linebackers like Raylan Wilson and C.J. Allen and Justin Williams and guys like that coming in, as talented as they are, those guys are younger players who haven't played as many snaps, who haven't contributed to national championships the way that some of the older guys on the roster haven't had that just invaluable experience for Georgia. And now the secondary is kind of lacking a little bit of experience outside of Malachi Starks. He's the only, heavy contributor to that success over the last few years. Now, you know that these guys are all really talented, but they've got to replace Javon Bullard, Tyke Smith, and Kamari Lassiter, which is 3 starters in a group that they typically, most downs, if you look at it, have 5 guys out there. 2 safeties, 2 corners, a nickel guy. They do play some dime packages, so you see an additional guy. That's where you see like a Dan Jackson come in as an extra corner or safety. You'll see this year, maybe it's KJ Bolden, maybe he fights for time, a freshman or a younger player, or an Ellis Robinson who gets in there on some of those dime packages. But at the very least, 3 out of 4 or 5, right? One of your safeties, your nickel guy, and one of your corners is leaving for Georgia this year. They're going to the draft. They've got to replace them, and they've got to replace them with guys that haven't played as much football. So it kind of circles you back to that question. Was Dominic Lovett dominating during spring practice because he has elevated and he is becoming a weapon for Georgia that is comparable to a star or a superstar, or is it because Georgia's secondary now doesn't have that high-end talent like Javon Bullard? We're talking about a guy who had 3 first turnovers in the national championship game, a guy who was the defensive MVP of Georgia's championship run in 2022. Tyke Smith, the player that led Georgia in both tackles and interceptions, was just all over the field. His statistically, Kamari Lassiter being one of the leaders of the team last year, being one of the rah-rah guys, being a guy that Kirby wanted by his side in press conferences, and a guy who brought him to SEC Media Days, and a guy that ultimately ended up being a high-end second-round pick in the NFL draft. Them being gone, it doesn't help, and this is something that Georgia has to go through every year. They had to lose Jordan Davis. They had to lose Jalen Carter. This is not a new thing for Georgia where they're losing all these. But a group that had a lot of leadership in it, right? What do you do with it, right? That's the question. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post here. Talking about Georgia's secondary, is it up for the challenge? Kirby Smart has a very good question about it that I've already discussed. Greg McElroy of ESPN also has some questions about it that I'm going to point out some of what he talked about in his podcast recently, where he ranked the top 10 secondaries in college football for this coming year. He ended up with Georgia at number 6 out of 10, behind schools like Ohio State, who just got a Caleb Downs in the transfer portal, schools like Notre Dame, who have recruited the secondary very well, Michigan, who has recruited the secondary well. Georgia ends up at 6 on his list. You look at PFF, right, Pro Football Focus, a database, a site, social media that is dedicated to gathering information and looking up advanced stats and analyzing it for the NFL and college football. Well, PFF has Georgia having the number 7 defensive back room in the country, the number 7 secondary in the country. So you look at Georgia, and there's a lot of ranking of number 1 and number 2 with almost everything that they've done recently, right? And you look at it, it's like, well, they're going to have one of the best quarterbacks, one of the best running backs, one of the best offensive lines. And then you get to the secondary, and it's like number 7. Well, it's not that big a deal. We're still talking about a top 10 unit in college football. This is a team, ultimately, that wants to go on and win a national championship. It's worst, and I'm putting air quotes on that worst, because these are really, really talented football players, and I think, maybe this 6, 7, these rankings, ultimately won't matter at the end of the day, and Georgia will be the secondary, it will boast the secondary that it has, but it's not that bad, even if it is true, and it is the 7th best secondary, or it is the 6th best secondary. It's still true that Georgia's secondary is going to be really, really good if that's the case. Let's go ahead and get to some of what Greg McElroy was saying, and this is all in a story that I published on dogpost.com earlier this week about Georgia's secondary. Go ahead and go check it out. I wrote about what Kirby said. It's basically, I'm talking about a lot of the things. If you want the more extended written version of this, go and check out dogpost.com. It's under our premium content. And make sure you're checking out our newsletter. I'm linking that in the description of this video down below. So he talks about a little bit of positives. Obviously, Malachi Starks is one of the best secondary players in the country, and having a guy like him and the leadership that he brings as well. This guy's been a mature, really well-spoken young man who's determined. I got to meet him when he was back in high school. This is the kind of person that understands leadership and what it takes, and he was a day one impact player for Georgia. That combination is pretty rare, so Malachi Starks is a rare combination, and you do have that in your secondary room, and it makes you feel better about the fact, well, hey, changing the guard can maybe be an easier transition when you already have another. Generational is a strong word for Malachi Starks, but a very, very high-level safety that should be a first-round pick in the NFL draft less than a year from now. That's what he said about Dalen Everett, right? The guy that's going to end up being the number 1 corner for Georgia this year. I think it's going to end up being Dalen Everett, Julian Humphrey. Maybe they rotate a little bit with some other guys, but I think those are probably going to be your starting corners. Malachi Starks is back there. Ja'Cory Thomas is competing, right? Dan Jackson's competing back there at safety. Jake Pope's competing back there. David Daniel Sisavon, KJ Bolden, a lot of guys are competing. I think Ja'Cory Thomas has a really good shot. I think KJ Bolden, can he have a Malachi Starks type of impact as a freshman? I don't know. I think that he looked very good at G-Day, so maybe he ends up winning that job. This is what he said about Jalen Everett, Greg McElroy. If you look at what they bring in Dalen Everett in the corner, they should be in a good position there as well. The problem there is that Everett got picked on a little bit last year from time to time. But you kind of look at where things are at and how things projected. He's going to be just fine. He's a talented player. He kind of had to get his feet wet. That's what you see with Georgia, and that's what's going to happen with Julian Humphrey a little bit, or Ellis Robinson or Daniel Harris, whoever ends up being the other corner. There's going to be a transition period where you have to get your feet wet. Same thing happened for Kamari Lassiter. Same thing happened for Keely Ringo. Same thing happened for Dalen Everett this past year, like he was talking about. I expect him to make a leap forward, and maybe the other guy has those hiccups. at the corner spot, but I don't think it's going to be anything that Georgia can't overcome. The interesting point, and this is how we'll round this out talking about this, the interesting point that Greg McElroy makes is, well, you look at the transition period from 21 to 22 to 23 and how the defensive line got worse because they lost that talent and they didn't replenish it with guys like Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter. Well, you can't, right? He makes the argument, what if some of these guys from the last couple of years are like that? I don't think that Javon Bullard and Kamar Lassiter and Tyke Smith and, as good as these secondary guys are, I don't know that they're as generational as some of the front seven guys that Georgia has lost over the last year, but it's an interesting thing to look at. Over the last 2 years, you lose five high-level contributors in the secondary the last 2 years. When you think about adding in Keely Ringo and Christopher Smith into that mix, is it just, hey, this new look secondary, even though you have a Malachi Starks, is it just not as good? I don't know. Maybe we should be viewing this from the other side of the coin where, hey, Dominic Lovett is just really good, and hey, this Georgia offense is going to be really good. I wanted to talk about this in the light of the secondary, but maybe we should also pose this question and discuss it from the offensive point of view. Because at the end of the day, what I saw with my eyes was Dominic Lovett looking really good for Georgia's offense, and still a very fast, very smart Georgia secondary that they're going to boast even if there's not as much experience over the last few years. So I think the answer is Dominic Lovett is really good. But no, Georgia secondary is probably not going to be quite as good when you lose that much experience, more so than talent. Thanks for watching.